Hey guys, we got a chaotic and wild week ahead of us on the World War III front. I'm going to break it all down. Let's get into it. Before I do that, I have to ask you guys, what the hell just happened in Russia? Can somebody please explain to me how a man who had the level of confidence and commitment and ambition required to want to do a coup d'etat in Russia was doing so well, executing the plan flawlessly, steamrolling on through, suddenly decides to accept a deal and go into exile? Something about that just doesn't add up. And look at here, what do we have on the screen? Maskirovka, the Russian art of deception. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. But really think about that. Put that in perspective. This is a man, the only resistance he faced when taking over one of the largest command and control centers in Russia that oversees 25% of Russian military activity and pretty much all of the military activity in Ukraine. He walked in there without a shot fired, to the cheers of screaming crowds in some cases. Not everybody was glad they were there, but many people were. And basically made it up the road past a few nuclear facilities, no questions asked, very little resistance. There was a few skirmishes here and there. This plan was going so well. He was within spitting distance of Moscow, and suddenly, you know what? This thing that I've been cooking up for months on end, if you believe Western intelligence agencies, I'm just going to shelve it for now and I'm just going to go into exile. Well, why do it in the first place? Because clearly you would know that there was going to be casualties. So why would Prigozhin ever do such a thing if he knew that that was going to be the result? I mean, they only lost one truckload of guys, allegedly, okay? And they knew that there would likely have to be bloodshed. There was no way that he's going to do a coup on the Kremlin and there'd be no bloodshed. I mean, come on. So now he's just an outlier. He's an outcast. He's in exile in Belarus, supposedly. It makes no sense whatsoever, guys. It really doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, we know that this guy has some mental health issues. I mean, if you're in the Wagner organization, you're probably a psychopath in the first place. That's why they like the convicts. That's why 40,000 of those guys are convicts. The Wagner organization is not a good organization. They exploit, they extort, they rape, they steal. They do a lot of crazy, nasty things in a lot of nasty countries around the world. Okay, I didn't mean that nasty countries. Scrap that part from the record. You guys know what I mean. They do a lot of nasty things in numerous countries around the world. And understand that he didn't have to do this. There was no reason to do this if the end result was just going to be, oh, we had one of our trucks destroyed, so now I'm going to go into exile. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So we're going to try to put the pieces together with respect to this today. And I got data points. I don't think I'm going to be able to weave this into some cohesive tapestry of speculation for you today, but I'll do my best. Okay, so what is Maskirovka? This is the Russian art of deception. Maskirovka is an insidious strategy that many Russian leaders, including Vladimir Putin, have used over the years to mislead opponents, overrepresent their strength, and flat out lie about what they have or have not done. Basically, it's Sun Tzu, it's the art of war, more or less. Stratagem. It's designed quite simply to keep adversaries permanently off balance, guessing what Moscow really intends. And this is what you have to do in modern war when we're living in the era of stratospheric balloons and satellite surveillance and in intelligence agencies where they just know every move that you're going to do next. You have to keep them guessing. It's very similar to strategic ambiguity in many ways. Now, why am I bringing this up? Some of you probably already know. Some of you are probably saying, you're thinking to yourself, Putin came out guns blazing and suddenly he strikes a deal with Lukashenko to take the Wagner group in exile. Why on earth would Lukashenko want the Wagner in his battalions of guys? And it was only, and this is the thing, it was only a few hundred guys apparently. It wasn't the entire 25,000. There was a large convoy, maybe a couple battalions, maybe a couple thousand guys. But this wasn't the entirety of the Wagner organization. It wasn't all 25,000 guys that were in these convoys taking up arms. That would require an incredible level of logistics. And I mean, you're talking about you know, guys who complained about trying to take Bakhmut and they're going to take Moscow. Now, the argument was that, well, yeah, Moscow did have a standing army there. They had this, I can't remember what they call, like a regional police force civic protection group, but it wasn't really military grade, so to speak. So they could have potentially made it in there with minimal bloodshed. But the one thing I don't get about, and this is the meme, let's just get to the point of what I'm talking about, okay? People think that this is all just a ploy to get Prigozhin into Belarus, close to Kiev, and prepare him to go to war with NATO on Russia's western flank. I guess you could say their western front. The problem with this is, especially with this meme, many people are saying, you know, they're making fun of the fact that they were 200 kilometers from Moscow, now they're only 100 kilometers from Kiev, haha. The Wagner group ain't doing nothing in Kiev. I mean, Kiev, and these are battle-hardened people. This is a city of what, like 2 million, 3 million people? I don't know how many people are still there. But you're talking about an organization who they claim was struggling to take a town that was 70,000 strong. And I know it's not so much the size of the town, it's how much people you're throwing into the meat grinder. But to take a place the size of Kiev, one in which is the terrain, there's so many rivers and there's so many obstacles, and to take Kiev would be very, very difficult. Unless they blew the dam and then they wiped out a good part of it, and maybe that's what the plan is, I don't know. But the idea that the Wagner group is going to spearhead, even if they were just the tip of the spear, I don't think they have the forces amassed. I mean, you need a 1 million strong army to try to hold down a place like Kiev. And I just don't think that would make any sense whatsoever right now. So I'm not really buying this theory that they're going there because they're going to raid Kiev. They may be putting them there though, and there's some weird Machiavellian theories out there like, well, maybe Wagner, because Wagner, most people don't realize, cannot legally operate inside of Russia, okay? And this whole thing came about because the Russian MOD basically wanted to incorporate Wagner. They wanted them to hand over the powers that they had in order to continue to function. So now they've basically been disassembled, and this guy has went into exile. So it went from 48 hours ago, this guy's the top dog, he can get anything he wants, and he's got all these people who look up to him, and he was starting to embark on this very successful campaign to now going into exile and possibly having a target on his back for what? It just doesn't make sense. So this makes me think that there's probably some, what's the word again? Maskirovka, or militia, as they say in Portuguese. It's deception. There's some deception maybe going on here. Apparently, according to the Telegraph, though, Russian agents threatened the family members of Wagner Group and Prigozhin, and that's why they called off the Moscow advance. There's all kinds of conflicting theories. Guys, these Wagner Group, they're not good people. Just get that straight right from the get-go. So when the West was calling them freedom fighters when they were en route to Moscow, it tells you everything you need to know about how we are going to frame these geopolitical situations to match with our interests when it's convenient. Nothing is as it seems. Nothing is as Western media says it is. We probably are the assholes in this situation, and that's just how it is. Now, let's talk about, oh geez, where should we go with this? I did not emphasize enough in my last video, okay? This brings me to this point. I did not emphasize enough in my last video that a weakened Russia is a dangerous Russia. A Russia with fewer options is incredibly dangerous, and that is something you definitely do not want. You do not want a Russia who is in a state of civil war and thus has fewer resources to commit to the Ukrainian conflict, if any, and has fewer options so that they might have to resort to utilizing non-conventional munitions such as nuclear weapons. You don't want that situation, because that's what would happen. If Russia descended into civil war, and understand that Russia's nuclear weapons were potentially under the control of the Wagner organization, or at least some of them, according to claims. And these are just rumors. But we know that in the south, he would have controlled like 25% of the military, okay? So likely would have had, and obviously there's chains of command, but people were just rolling over. They were opening the door to this guy. So what does that mean? Obviously they don't respect Shoigu, they don't respect Gerasimov, so we know there's changes coming probably in the next 24 hours to the Russian Ministry of Defense. They're probably going to put Surovikin up there, somebody who the Wagner head, Prigozhin, actually does respect, allegedly, because he has had numerous military battle-hardened experience in Afghanistan, in Syria, a couple other places, and of course in the Ukraine war now, overseeing that. So we know that, there was that divide. But here's what the West doesn't want. They don't want Putin in there because he's not the hardliner that they need in order to really kickstart this World War III stuff. And you might be saying, Nate, that's crazy. NATO doesn't want World War III. Well, I don't know about that. I'm starting to think we do. Because think about it. If you thought that Putin was incompetent, if you thought that he was making all of these mistakes and he was mishandling the conflict, why would you ever intervene? Why wouldn't you wouldn't want a coup? Because if Prigozhin or some hardliner gets in place, which is what these guys behind me, this is what they're pushing for right now. They are pushing Putin to have no choice but to do a full-scale war mobilization. And that's what's coming next. Mark my words, that is what's coming next. Putin is going to have no choice but to succumb to the pressures of these hardliners and start getting tougher in terms of how he's waging this war in Ukraine. He's going to have no choice whatsoever. He's probably going to do it by changing. First, he'll change out the head of the MOD, and then they'll start changing their tactics in ways which are far more aggressive. And this is going to become a real deal war, and there won't be any more parties in Kiev because there'll be no electricity. And the West, they want Putin gone. Because Putin, in many ways, is a genius. And I don't say this because I like the guy per se. I mean, he's affiliated with this Wagner stuff, KGB stuff. I don't like Putin per se. I'm sure that he loves his country and all those things. But I don't like some of the things that he's been affiliated with and associated with. And that's just my opinion. And of course, I don't like the fact that they invaded Ukraine. I understand the backstory to that and all that. But I think there may have been alternative ways that they could have dealt with that situation. But this guy scares NATO because right now he's preparing for war with NATO, okay? And he's doing this by taking a softer approach in Ukraine. He's looking at the grand macroeconomic chessboard. He's making all the right moves that he needs to make to win this thing strategically, to in the long run come out on top. It's not about losing battles. It's not about a frozen conflict. All of that stuff doesn't really matter if in the end of the day you become an economic powerhouse. And that's what they're trying to do. So Putin is not just haphazardly throwing the best stuff he has and doing these very overly committing to this Ukrainian conflict and overly engaging because he probably knows that's what the West wants. Another genius move of Vladimir Putin, and I've been talking about this in numerous videos in the run-up to all this stuff, is that he triangulates all his generals, okay? So you have the MOD, you have Kadyrov, you have General Surovikin. Both Kadyrov and Surovikin, I think there's four kind of parties there. So you have Wagner, you have Surovikin and friends, you have the Russian MOD. I was going to give you guys the finger, but I won't do that. And then you have the Chechens, the Kadyrov. Kadyrov was en route to go and fight Wagner. Okay, these guys saddled up and they're making jokes and stuff, how they're walking around Moscow and nothing's going on. That's all fine now. Hey, this guy, he jumped when as soon as Putin said he needed help, Kadyrov was there. He had his back. And this is why Putin is such a genius. Because he knows when you're running this kind of thing. See, most people, if they're running that sort of dictatorship or authoritarian society. And I'm not saying it's a dictatorship in the purest sense. It's more of a authoritarian / capitalist sort of thing. They would not be that wise to do that. Okay, they would not be that wise to have their generals kind of at odds and guessing, keep everybody guessing. And this is where the genius of Putin comes in, and his utilization of that word maskirovka comes in, because you have to have all these different generals just in case one gets out of line. You have the other 2 or 3 to keep them in line. The next guy gets out of line, you have the other 2 or 3 to keep them in line, and you keep everybody guessing, right? So today, Igor Girkin, who was a former KGB, I think, or FSB. Anyways, he's fairly well known. He's fairly outspoken, sometimes critic of how Putin has been prosecuting the war. He's basically said that Putin has to act as commander-in-chief or resign. And in this little video clip that I showed you here, he essentially says that if the current president is not ready to take the lead in putting the country on a war footing, then he needs to resign. Okay? If he is not ready for the powers of Supreme Commander-in-Chief, then he simply needs to hand them over. When he says a war footing, he's talking about total war. He's talking about, let's get this done already. Let's go full-scale mobilization. Let's do whatever we have to do. Let's put as many guys as we need to into this fight and end this thing before, I don't know, I guess they don't think that the war is going well, because they don't see Putin's long-term macroeconomic attritional vision of him winning out NATO in the long run and possibly even destabilizing the NATO alliance. See, I think that's where Putin is thinking long game. You see, we are such short-term thinkers here in the West. Maybe if you believe that there's some deep state that operates things, maybe they have the flexibility to think a bit more long-term. But because we have a political system where every 4 years we have to vote, that means it's very difficult for us to have these ambitious long-term goals, which may take away from short-term goals that you need in order to get reelected. So we never, can deal with these big, large-scale problems because we're always just trying to get elected again. Whereas these authoritarian leaders, they can think long-term. If Putin was smart, which I think he is, he wants NATO to be destabilized. I mean, the best way to get rid of your enemy is to make them your friend. And I think that's what he probably has planned with countries like Turkey. And you never know what other countries are going to turn, okay? Because once one of the domino falls, that's it. So understand that a weakened Russia has fewer options. And one of those is the nuclear option. So people who are cheering on a civil war in Russia, even if you did think that that would somehow empower Ukraine and give them the upper hand in the conflict that they're fighting, it drastically increases the likelihood that Russia will go nuclear, which is why our leaders were so concerned. In fact, they were very concerned that if Prigozhin got into power, that there indeed would be the use of tactical nuclear weapons, because he's been openly stating that, and to be clear, I don't think that Prigozhin wanted to be the president per se, but he probably, for all intents and purposes, he would have been the leader, even though he wasn't the president. Because if you're the strong man who is behind the puppet, then you effectively run the country, okay? And many people were concerned here that Putin looked weak in exiling Prigozhin. But in many ways, he handled the situation in the only way you could have under these circumstances. He was ready to fight with the Chechens and Kadyrov and the Air Force and whatever, and they would have won that fight. 9 times out of 10, the Russians would have won that fight. You're not taking over Moscow with a couple battalions of guys. No matter how much, how battle hardened they are, it's not going to happen with no logistics. I mean, forget about it. They couldn't do Bakhmut. The guys ranting and raving about not having enough bullets to fight, a few thousand Ukrainians. How is he going to fight a million Muscovites? So it's just not going to happen. Anyways, what else do we have to talk about today? As I said, speculated, and I didn't know about this before I speculated about this. It seemed intuitive to me. As confirmed by the New York Times, U.S. intelligence knew about Prigozhin's ambitions. Okay, so they knew about it, And this was likely why you had all this rhetoric in the run-up to this thing, especially right now, where in the coming week ahead, Budanov, the intelligence director in Ukraine, has said that there's a high likelihood that there's going to be a nuclear incident in terms of the nuclear power plant. He claims that the plan for some sort of provocative action in the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant is about to be exercised by the Russians. It's been approved, and the plan is something to the effect of they're going to blow up or they're going to disconnect it permanently from the cooling system, so they're not going to be able to cool the fuel rods, and that's going to lead to a radiological incident. And of course, that's the incident they need for NATO to get involved. Okay, I should have just started the video with this story because this is the biggest story. They are now saying, and let me show you the actual news report. This is absolutely insane how somebody could be so dumb to believe this. And to give them the benefit of the doubt, maybe there's something to this. But think about this. If the Russians are winning the counteroffensive, which even the West is conceding that they are, the Russians are defending against the counteroffensive, why on earth would you blow up a nuclear power plant that you were in total control of? Okay, that there was no risk that you were about to lose. Why on earth would you do that right now? Think about it. I mean, the Nord Stream thing was one thing. The dam thing was another, because of course Russia's defenses were wiped out and now the Ukrainians are coming across the river where that happened. Okay, go figure. That was another thing, but this is just, I mean, come on. And all of a sudden, Lindsey Graham and Blumenthal come out and they're like, yep, if anything nuclear happens in Ukraine, we got to send all the guns in and we got to go to nuclear war with Russia. Come on, guys, that's no coincidence. And this is the article today. Ukrainska Pravda plan to blow up Zaporozhye nuclear power plant approved. Situation has never been so severe before. Really? They're saying that they got trucks loaded with bombs. The Russians have trucks loaded with bombs and they're positioning them near the reactors. I guess they're concerned that the Ukrainians are going to be able to take over the plant. Is that the idea? Because as of right now, anyways, they're not making any progress. Now, I will say, this would make sense. The only way this makes sense is if the Russians are losing to the Ukrainians in the counteroffensive. Because then there is motive for the Russians to want to blow this up to try to stall or create some sort of situation where the Ukrainians couldn't advance. That's the only situation where this makes sense. Now, the Ukrainians claim that they still have 10 or 12 brigades that they're sitting on, waiting to release after they're done these probing operations. And they did, to their credit, say that this was going to take several weeks in order to pull off. So, you know, we're only, like 3 weeks into it. But as of now, for them to be talking about this is suspicious. Now, for people who might be saying that, well, the Ukrainians are going to do some kind of false flag, that wouldn't be that easy to pull off either. Because these reactors, as far as I know, they're very hardened, and you would need a very powerful missile in order to blow them up. And if you did hit them with a missile, well, then that's different than a truck, right? So all the Russians would have to show is video proof of a missile hitting it, and then people would have a lot of explaining to do. So both of sides, it just doesn't seem feasible. It doesn't seem feasible that they could pull off a false flag unless there were some secret operatives working inside the plant that they were about to do something. There was nuclear materials that went missing, according to the Russians, just a few weeks ago that wasn't documented by the International Atomic Energy Agency. And of course, we know that there's all kinds of nuclear sensors in around this region. So basically, the incentive there now, they've created the incentive for the Ukrainians to do a nuclear incident at this place. Now, hopefully it's not as bad as they say it is, even if there is some incident. Maybe it's just going to be a small scale release, or, you know, but they've basically created the incentive for the Ukrainians to create a nuclear incident which would welcome NATO into the country or some other force. Maybe they won't call it NATO, so they don't have to evoke Article 5. Whatever the case, it doesn't look good. It does not look good, okay? What are some other points that I need to cover today? So, if this makes Putin look weak, what has just happened, he's going to have to appear stronger. And he's going to have no choice. And so for people who are saying, this makes Putin look really weak, well, then what does he have to do? He has to act in a way which is strong. And to act in a way which is strong is not good for the Ukrainians, okay? That's just something to keep in mind. Did I talk about how Belarus detained 33 Wagner mercenaries ahead of their presidential election in 2020? I'm not sure if I did, but that's one of the things that doesn't really map on to this idea that he's just going to go to Belarus and, live out his final days and lay low, and that the Wagner organization is going to be disbanded, and a lot of weird things with this guy. Like, this is what they found in his room, all right? They found his identification, obviously, gold bars, so we know he's a prepper, US dollars. So it's funny because of the whole ruble BRICS de-dollarization thing, but the biggest Wagner Russian gangsters are carrying around USD. And apparently some bricks of the white stuff. So Zelensky isn't the only guy who likes to powder his nose, apparently. And another mysterious post by the Wagner Telegram that's making reference to the Ukrainian Shush campaign, where they're trying to encourage people not to talk about the ongoing offensive operations, so to not reveal any secrets to the other side to increase the likelihood of its success. Well, the Wagner are doing something similar. So what are they implying here? Are they implying that we're about to see episode 2 of this saga? I think so. This is definitely not over yet. We're about to see something. I do not think that Wagner is going to Belarus for the specific purpose of spearheading an offensive into Kiev, but he may be going there to help bolster those forces. It's a possibility if we are thinking that this is some Machiavellian play, but then you have to somehow reconcile, if that were true, Putin doesn't look good, and he's not going to be able to openly support Wagner again. He's never going to be able to openly support Prigozhin in any way capacity. It's very likely that Prigozhin goes there and falls out a window, as they say. But yeah, so that's why I don't really buy that. But I don't buy the whole thing. The only way this makes sense is if Prigozhin is just unhinged, he's impulsive, he's bipolar, he made a decision on a whim and just as fast turned around on a whim. That's the only way this thing makes sense. And then you had a bunch of jailbirds who got out, who were institutionalized, who have nothing better going for them. They decided to follow him into battle, and they're all pissed off because he abandoned them now. Maybe he got a payout. Either way, Prigozhin he's got a lot of money. There's probably a lot of oligarchs and elites who benefit from their corrupt activities around the world. So there's a lot more to this story than I can even begin to get into. But what we know is that there's likely changes coming to the Russian MOD. I would say this week. I'm guessing that they're going to put in General Surovikin as either the head of the MOD or the chief of staff. And that means that the war is going to get more aggressive in Ukraine. According to some people, like Vucic, foreign powers were in fact involved in the coup. They didn't just predict it, they were involved in it. Now, according to, I don't know if it's the CIA or US intelligence, they claim that they knew about it, but they didn't want to tell the Russians about it because then the Russians would have suspected that they were in on it. And I mean, that's the world we're living in now, right? Because there's some merit to that statement. If the CIA came out and said, hey, Wagner is trying to coordinate a coup in Russia, there'd be a big part of the internet, the same tinfoil hat crowd, would say, yeah, that means you're probably planting a false flag or something, right? So I get what they're saying. I mean, you're damned if you do, or you're damned if you don't. So Did they have a hand in this? Well, if they did, why, if it was going so well, would they turn around? Was this just to smoke out all the weak links and to consolidate power in Russia, in the Russian military, like I predicted in the last video? Was that the case? I don't know. But something just doesn't add up. Either way, we are just one more step closer. We've checked one more box on our pathway towards nuclear escalation today. It appears as though Ukraine is screaming at the top of its lungs across every one of its major news sources today. They're screaming that the world needs to pay attention because Russia is getting prepared to do some kind of thing at the nuclear power plant. That's all they're talking about. And this is suspicious unto itself, because you'd think with all this stuff ongoing in Russia, the Ukrainian MOD, or their equivalent, whatever they have, their defense ministry, was surprisingly quiet. Like they didn't seem like they were exploiting the situation in the way that they really could. Or it seemed like they could have exploited it a lot more. So I was a little taken aback by that, how they, why aren't they talking about this more? Why are they still running on about this nuclear power plant stuff when there's quite possibly a civil war in Russia? Like, shouldn't you be trying to activate all your saboteurs and your partisan groups and, those Nazi guys who were fighting, the Russian Nazi guys who were fighting against? Shouldn't you be trying to activate these guys at times like these? I mean, this is a time, like that was the time to start shit in Russia if there ever was one. Now, apparently it's over. So strange. What we do know is all the precedent for martial law in Russia is set. He signed a Law Measures Act. Basically, what it amounted to in this counterterrorism operation mode is that it allows law enforcement to inspect any citizens in cars, restrict the movement and population in transport wherever they deem fit, control and restrict. This is I used a image language converter, so this is the bad translation. Evacuate the population from various places, suspend the operation of hazardous industries, strengthen the protection of individual objects, yada, yada, yada. And traffic restrictions on Russia's M4 Don highway remain in force in Moscow. And they originally had an order that Monday was going to be a holiday, but now they're saying that you can go to work if you want, or you can have business up and running if you want. There's more mobilization underway in Ukraine, in addition to that which was talked about just a few days ago. And I think that's pretty much all I need to talk about with you guys today. Yeah. British general is concerned that Wagner could attack Kiev. You really got to think about the logistics of that. Even if they did that, it would not go well. It would not go well for them. What else do we got to talk about here? Apparently, some people are suspecting that there's been an abnormal amount of emergency action messages lately. I know they're wrapping up one of the biggest NATO exercises ever. And these emergency action messages are messages that are sent from command and control to various parts of the nuclear triad in the United States. And so if you see an uptick in activity and duration of these messages, it's sometimes might indicate that something's going on. But this is encrypted information, so you don't know exactly what's being said. So you can only go on the basis of the frequency of the messages and the duration of the messages. Apparently there's an uptick in that right now. Honestly, I don't really, at this point in time, it's all white noise. It's so difficult to interpret. But always be ready, because, things could just pop off at any given minute. And of course, we got a big event happening next month. The summit in Vilnius is just 2 weeks away, and that's when we're going to really know how committed NATO is to this conflict and how far we're going to go and how far we're going to bring ourselves to the brink of nuclear Armageddon. With that said, we were going to release a lot of other more actionable, practical, preparedness-related videos this weekend. And it always happens when we have plans to release big videos, something else comes up. And there's no point in releasing those videos because people are just too transfixed on this whole Russia issue. So we'll talk about this until, let's hope, the situation kind of settles down a little bit. But I think it's going to be an interesting week. And, you know, just keep on prepping, guys. We got countless video, hundreds, if not over 1,000 videos that aren't like this, where I'm just giving you the daily news, or actually showing you how to do stuff, talking about prepping related concepts. They're all blue strip. They have the blue strip along the side of the thumbnail instead of the red. So you can go check those out and get all of your preparedness gear stuff, which has been thoroughly vetted by YouTube gear reviewers like myself at CanadianPreparedness.com. Stay well, everybody, and enjoy the dog days of summer. It's getting hot outside. Canadian Prepper out.